Hello everyone, welcome to a new video. If you are anything like me, you have probably ended up down many Pinterest rabbit holes. On one of these occasions, I came across a few different schematics for a sort of vintagey looking skirt that looked pretty interesting, and most importantly, easy. Here are the diagrams I mean. It seems to be just a run-of-the-mill circle skirt with a fitted yoke section at the waist. Looks easy, right? For this project, I bought this lovely cotton check. It's a really nice weight. But wait, Kat, we've seen this fabric before. Now, that is true, friend. In my pleated skirt video, I mentioned I had a plan for a skirt originally which didn't go well. Spoiler alert. On to planning. I drew out the schematic and figured out the dimensions. Circle skirts are a circle that you cut out. Duh. The radius equals the length of the desired skirt plus hem allowance. Instead of cutting out a small circle at the center of this circle, you mark a square. The sides of the square are equal to 1/4 of your hip measurement, plus seam allowance. You then mark diagonals across this square which will be cut into flaps, into which the hexagonal yoke sections will be sewn. To figure out the dimensions of these hexagonal bits, I had to wing a lot of it. The top side of the hexagon will be equal 1/4 of your waist, plus seam allowance. The bottom two sides of the hexagon will be equal to the diagonal flaps from inside the square. The sides of the hexagon were up for grabs, so I decided to make them a similar size to the other edges. Now this is where I went wrong, and I think I know why. The difference between my waist and hip size is over 10 inches, which means my hexagon shapes needed to be a lot shorter because of the dramatic difference. We'll come back to this a little later. I pre-washed my fabric and laid it out. The first step was to cut it into a square like in the diagram. The length of my skirt was equal to the width of my fabric, which was 1.5 meters. I marked 1.5 meters into the length of the fabric and cut it, giving me a square. I then folded this square across the width and the length, essentially having 4 layers of fabric. From the corner, I pinned my measuring tape and measured down to the desired length of the skirt, which for me was just as long as it could fit in the fabric. I used this measurement to mark a 1/4 circle around the fabric and then cut along this line. This gives you a perfect circle of fabric. Now for a typical circle skirt, you would just cut a smaller circle at the top for your waist, but for this you mark a square out of the center equal to 1/4 of your hip size. Mine was 48 centimeters. You then mark the diagonals across the square, which go through the center point, and you cut across these diagonals up to the corners of the square, giving you 4 flaps. I left my skirt to hang overnight at this point. Since it's cut on the bias, it can stretch and lead to an uneven hem. I would actually recommend leaving it to stretch before cutting the flaps because it's easier to hang up. I then moved on to cutting the hexagonal shapes. I marked one edge to be 1/4 of my waist size. The 2 bottom edges are equal to the measurement of the diagonal flaps. The last measurement I just made equal-ish to my other measurements to give me an even shape, as in the diagram. If at this point I had held up these shapes to my waist, I would have noticed they were way too big. But alas, I did not. I pinned the bottom side of the hexagonal shape into the flap and sewed it by machine. I then pinned the other side and sewed it, carefully aligning the tip of the V. This can be tricky, but if you align the 2 seams perfectly, you should have a smooth V. I had 2 good ones and 2 bad ones, so the bad ones went towards the back of the skirt. And repeat for all the flaps. You can see here a less good V and a better V. With all the hexagonal shapes sewn, you can move on to doing the center front seam and the side seams. I left the back open as I will need to put in a zipper. I just pinned these seams and sewed as usual. At this point, I decided to check the fit of the skirt before proceeding. Thank goodness I did, because I had created a monster. It looks bad on my dress form, but it looked even worse on me. The hexagonals came all the way to my underbust, and if I moved them to sit at my waist, the flare bits were at my knees. The proportions were all wrong. It was awful. At this point, discouraged, I shoved the skirt in a box and left it alone. But I really liked the fabric, so I decided to try to fix it. I put it on my dress form inside out and positioned it so that the flared bit was at my hips. I trimmed the top of the hexagons away by around 5 inches and then pinned out the excess fabric at the seams, smoothing as I went, essentially creating some darts. This helped a lot. A brief interlude so I can cut out the waistband and most importantly the pockets. Pockets, you say? But didn't you just sew up the side seams? Twice, Kat. Yes. Yes, I did. Once my pockets were cut, I sewed each pocket together and flat felled the seams by hand. I was stressing about this skirt, so it was good to do something I actually knew how to, but which was also marginally unnecessary. I went in and trimmed out some excess from the darts and unpicked them, being careful to keep marked that seam line so that the fit was the same. I turned under the raw edges of the pocket's mouth and the skirt edges and pinned them together. I then top stitched them by machine. I then basted the back seam closed and placed my zipper so that it was right at the middle. I pinned and basted it in place. I swapped out my machine's foot for a zipper foot and top stitched around the seam. I first saw this method in a 1940s dress pattern, but thank you to everyone who also recommended it in the pleated skirt video. So I think I have decided this is the skirt from hell. I don't know where I last left off. This was meant to be a sewing video and it's now some sort of a vlog because I've run into a lot of problems and I find it's a lot easier to explain how I'm tackling them as they come. So this skirt, I think the last time I mentioned it to you guys that it was doing weird things, I inserted these darts and I fitted it well on the dress form. But then I found that while on me, it created some weird pouchiness in the worst area to have any kind of pouchiness. And it happens in the front and the back and the sides. But because the sides have the pockets, I'm not bothered. But at the front, it definitely looked dodgy and it looked weird in the back as well. But this skirt will not defeat me. I will keep fiddling with it until it's done. I'm in no rush. I will win. So instead, what I've done is I've sort of smoothed out that excess from the fabric. I think because it was on the bias, it warped a bit there, which is the worst place for it to warp. But so I've pinned it up. You can sort of see here a little bit. So this is the dart line here, and this is where I've pinned up a little bit of the excess. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo the dart. I'm going to pin up and sew this excess up, and then re-sew the dart. And also make sure I taper it a bit better down here so it doesn't create that weird poof. And do something similar in the back, but it's a lot harder to fit because I can't quite reach. But I'm not too worried. Who really looks at the back anyway? But yeah, so that's the plan of attack. Wish me luck. So here we are, guys. I've managed to fix it. It is not the prettiest fix ever, but I feel like it looks a lot better. And from far apart, I don't think it's too noticeable. Don't really care. So this is passable. This is okay. I can live with this. I really want to save this skirt because I really like the fabric and I didn't want to waste it. And there's nothing I can do with it now because it's cut in such a weird way. So as you can see, pockets are still, the side bits are still rippling weirdly. The pockets are already in, so I can't really do anything else about that. Which is sad because I actually think this skirt could be really flattering if it wasn't so wrinkly. I'm going to press them a bit more, see if that helps. But the other thing is that the butt looks terrible. Look at this little poochy thing. But alas, I have already put in the zipper as well, so unless I went in and removed the zipper, I'm not sure I can fix this. I'm going to try because like I said, it won't defeat me. I can do this.
Vlogcat has explained some further fixes, but I also did go in and unpick the zipper and redo the whole thing after pinching out the excess at the back too. Again, none of these problems will happen if your hexagons are right from the beginning. A mock-up is recommended. I ironed my waistband in half and then ironed one long edge inwards by the seam allowance, 1/2 inch. I then pinned the unfolded long edge to the top of the skirt, right sides facing each other, leaving 1/2 inch or so sticking out at the ends. Then the waistband is flipped up and inwards and the folded edge pinned into place. I sewed it down by hand with a whip stitch, also turning the ends inwards to create a neatly finished edge at the center back. I also went in and finished all of the interior seams with some lace tape. It's easier to finish the seams earlier on, but because I had to keep refitting the skirt, I didn't want to commit to finishing those edges. I added one hook and eye to the waistband. Finally, to finish the hem, I sewed some bias tape onto it, with the right sides facing each other. Then this is ironed inwards and hand sewn into place with a herringbone stitch. Overall, this skirt was a journey, and evidence that something deceptively simple on Pinterest cannot be trusted. I do believe my issues were all because of my body shape and the large difference between my waist and hip. However, hopefully if you've seen this diagram, you can look out for these issues. I am quite pleased I persevered and made something, although wonky, still wearable and very comfortable. Thank you for watching.